Okay, let's continue with measuring GDP and specifically the expenditures approach. Again, there are three approaches. One is the expenditure approach, the other one is the income approach, and the third one is the value-added approach. And we will do all three. So the expenditure approach, which is the most common one, basically says national income, which is GDP, and you remember GDP is the total value of all final goods produced within a country, typically over a year. And but who is it, who can make expenditures? And well, those are basically the households, and those are the firms and the government and the foreign sector. So C is consumption, and it is largely related to household activity. Not exclusively, but that's how you can think of it. Then investment, well, that is mostly done by the firms. And again, not exclusively, because the government can also invest, but if you want to think about the economic actors closest related to those expenditure categories, of course, government is the government, and exports minus imports, well, that would be essentially the foreign sector. It's not an exclusive definition, but it's something that may help a little bit to think about it. There's like households, firms, government, and the foreign sector. And households, whatever they do, that is mostly, not exclusively, we will talk about some exceptions. That's consumption, firms, typically investment, government spending, and exports minus imports. So you may be wondering, why is GDP? And another way of writing it, sometimes we just write GDP as Y. So Y equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. So again, GDP is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country over a year, but the imports, well, they are obviously not produced in our country, but in some other country, and we get it from there. So why do we still show it? The answer is in national accounting, we record imports, but in a way in which it does not count towards GDP, because GDP is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country. So how can we record imports, which is still interesting, but record it in a way so that it does not violate the assumption of GDP, or to violate the definition of GDP, which is GDP is the total market value of all goods and services, final goods and services produced within a country. So now let's think about it. Let's say you buy a computer from Japan, which is worth $100. So then we will record $100 here as imports, but then this $100 can be either attributed to consumption if a household bought that computer. So then it might show up here as $100, or it also maybe it shows up as investment if a firm got that computer, or maybe the government bought a new computer. So the $100 can also maybe show up here, or it shows up as government spending. So in any of those three, it will show up. So the $100 is either here, or here, or here, government, right? So it cancels out. So we record it, but we record it in a way so that it never affects GDP. So, okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into what consumption, investment, and government spending means, because now we have a few exceptions that are a little bit important. So consumption is the purchase of all durable goods. And a durable good is, for example, a PC, a personal computer. A non-durable good, that could be like food, something that's perishable, like a cheeseburger. And a service is like medical treatment, a doctor visit, those kind of things. So that is all consumption. So that's pretty straightforward. We distinguish durable goods and non-durable goods and services. And like most nations, statistical agencies, they often report how much durable goods and non-durable goods were purchased. So then the other category is investment. So investment is all the business investment, like office buildings, office supplies, but also new machines like capital goods, everything that's being used to produce fine goods and services. But now here we have one exception to the previous classification, where we said, consumption is typically done by households. Well, households can also invest. So if you buy or if you build a new home as a household, then this is considered investment. So this is important, because this is considered investment, even though a household builds the new home. So all residential construction, that is considered to be an investment, and that would be like an exception to the rule that consumption is typically done by the households. Another important concept of investment is change in inventories. So that means if, for example, a company produces, so assume a company produces 100 the company produces, let's say, let's say it's a bicycle company, and the company produces 100 bicycles in year X. So in some year, the company produces 100 bicycles in year X, but it only sells 50 bicycles. Okay, so but then that means the 50 bicycles that are not sold go into the inventory. They will probably sell them next year. So that means the inventory goes up by 50 bicycles, and that is considered to be an investment. So if the price of the bicycle is, for example, $100, it would be a cheap bicycle, but just to keep it simple, then investment would go up by 5,000 US dollars. Because GDP is the total market value of all final goods and services produced. It doesn't have to be the final goods and services purchased. So if, let's say, the company produced bicycles but didn't sell them all, well, the production of the bicycle was still associated with somebody else's income, the worker's income, and because expenditures always needs to equal income, it doesn't really matter whether the bicycle company actually sold the bicycle. Okay, so that's another important thing to remember, that the change in inventory, that's an investment, and residential construction is an investment. So now let's turn to the government, because here we also have some exceptions. So obviously government spending is all spending on governmental administration. That includes military technology and salaries for public officials. And but it also includes like spending on public goods like highways and ports and airports and those kind of things. So that is all considered to be government spending. And this is important, government spending does not include social security payments or interest payments on public debt. And that is actually, some economists are a little bit concerned with that position in the government's account, because first of all, interest payments already account for a lot in many countries, and so do social security payments. But that does not count. So why does it not count? The reason is that it avoids, again, double counting. So it avoids double counting. That's one explanation. I think that's the most intuitive to think about it. Because the idea is, in a social security payment, let's say somebody receives a social security check or an unemployment check. Well, if the government already recorded it as an expenditure, but then the individual receiving the social security payment spends the money associated with it, we would count it twice. And so therefore we do not count it. The reason, something similar, a similar argument can be made for interest payments. So if the government pays interest, and already would classify that as a government expenditure, and then you as a bondholder receive the interest payment, and then you buy a bicycle from the money, we would also count it twice. But another definition is that, for example, if you pay interest payments, you do not get an immediate final good or service in exchange for it. And again, GDP is the total market value of all final goods and services produced, but interest payments is not really tied to a final good or a service. And the same is a little bit, the same holds for the social security payments, which is essentially just administering other people's money. So as long as you work, you pay into your social security accounts, and then once you, let's say, retire or you get your social security check, well, then you receive it again. And that is why the Social Security agency in the United States is, for example, called the Social Security Administration, because it just administers other people's money. But at least in theory, in practice, the Social Security Administration needs to pay much more than what it ultimately collects. So, but anyhow, that's a different problem. Just for definitional clarity. So exceptions to government spending, which may take up a huge chunk of government spending, but which does not count directly as government spending, is social security payments and interest payments. And the main reason I think that makes sense is that it avoids double counting, because somebody who receives that money will ultimately spend it on something else. And the other reason is we don't really get directly a good or service in exchange for it. Okay, so now let's move to exports and imports. So that's pretty straightforward. So a foreign country's expenditures on goods and services produced in our home country, that is exports, and of course exports are an inflow of income. And imports, those are obviously things that are being produced in other countries, and an import is a leakage of income. And again, technically an import does not affect GDP, because GDP is the total market value of all final goods and services produced in our country over a year. But as I mentioned earlier, we still write the expenditure approach to the national income system such that we have consumption plus government spending plus investment. And of course investment could also be done by the government. Like if the government builds a new airport, well, that would be considered also investment. And exports, so those are all expenditures by someone within our economy that creates income to somebody within our economy, but not imports. So now what we do is we subtract imports, because that's a leakage. So here we have a negative, but then what we import, that shows either up maybe as consumption or as government spending or as investment. So it cancels out. We record it, but it doesn't matter. Okay, so that's pretty much the expenditure approach, and in the next video we start working on the income approach, which probably takes a little bit less time.